My latest travel saw me yet again in Eastern Europe, this time in Romania, which was the perfect place for the spooky season. So we'll skip the tacky intro and get right into 50 things you might not know about Romania. One of the many traditions in Romania involves lighting candles at funerals, which is seen as guiding the souls during the night. Furthermore, it keeps away the snakes, which is said to represent evil. A server at one of our restaurants told me this as he lit our candle. But, speaking of food, sarmale is the national dish of Romania, which is basically a cabbage roll, and it takes on many different forms depending on how it's prepared. Cabbage as a whole is pretty important in the country, but honestly, every menu had some variation of pork neck, bacon, sausage, other variations of this mixed with anything such as soups, polentas, eggs, potatoes, and anything. Romania, despite being surrounded by Slavic countries, is actually considered East Romance and is not Slavic at all. This means it falls into the same language category as Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian. Yeah, we're going to start with these topics early on. Do you remember the Hungary video when I said Hungarian nationalists think that Transylvania should be part of Hungary? Haha, well, a guide that I had for a little city tour told me basically the same exact story as the Hungarian guide from that, but the way she worded it was Hungary colonized us. I love hearing two sides of the same story told completely differently. However, let's be real, Transylvania is sort of an entity of its own and it's been swapped around all throughout history. It was once part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was more of an autonomous principality. But let's be real, when we think of Transylvania, we're all thinking of Dracula. Dracula's castle was based off of this one, the Bran Castle, which goes back to the 14th century when the Hungarian king Louis the Great urged the Saxons, who have been there since the 12th century, to build a castle. Yeah, Romania has a lot of German history too. It was once used to stop Ottoman expansion, and over time it would become occupied by professional soldiers and mercenaries. Eventually, Vlad the Impaler would step in, which we'll get to in a minute, and by the 18th century, renovations on the northern tower were completed. You can obviously visit this today like we did, but I'm going to warn you, it is a very touristy spot and it gets packed on the inside. Now, this castle may have inspired Dracula's castle, however, Vlad the Impaler is the guy that inspired Dracula himself, so let's talk about him. His real name was Vlad Tepes III, born in the city of Sibiu in 1431 and ruled for several decades. Little side note, that is one of the nation's neatest historical cities, which I unfortunately didn't have time to see. The nickname comes from his well-known cruel means of punishment, often impaling, oh, shocker, in ways meant to keep the victim alive for days before they would bleed out or die of hunger or thirst. And all of this was really a means of deterring Ottoman forces that may have gotten some bright ideas to attack. The ruler before him was Vlad Dracul II, and the name Dracula simply means son of Dracul. Let's look at some other things around Vlad the Impaler. The Ponari Fortress is situated way out in the middle of the Carpathian Mountains, which is now in ruins, but is still a sought-after site. This was basically Vlad the Impaler's actual home, being one of the most impenetrable fortresses in all of Romania. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a very close look, but here's a picture of me doing the pointy wojak. Stepping outside of Transylvania just a little, we're going to take a look at the city known as Tarhoviste. Vlad the Impaler actually briefly lived there too. Only about 80 kilometers from the capital of Bucharest at the southeastern part of the Carpathian Mountains. This was actually the old capital of Wallachia, which formed the modern state of Romania by joining with what is now Moldova in 1859. Yeah, Romania as we know it is actually pretty young despite how old its history is. The big draw here would be the Cindia Tower, a monument from the 16th century, as well as a 17th century church founded by Vasil Lupastian, an old prince of Moldova. And hey, these were free to enter and check out. But let us move on from medieval history for a hot second. The Danube River runs along much of the nation and forms a lot of the border with Bulgaria to the south. The Carpathian Mountains, which you've heard me mention several times now, is the third longest mountain range in Europe, topped only by the Urals and Scandinavia. As you can see, they're truly breathtaking in the fall season, and the highest peak in the Romanian borders reach over 2,600 meters, that being the Moldovano Peak in the Fagarish Mountains. Should you decide to drive through here, do bear in mind how windy the roads get and watch out for bears. Speaking of that, the brown bear is not the only animal you'll find in these parts. Lynx, wolves, and other wildcats are found in abundance within these mountains, and considering how many mammals here are threatened with extinction, this population is pretty important. The road that traverses much of these mountains is called the Transfăgărașan Highway. A windy and dangerous road was built from 1970 to 1974, meant to act as a fast military escape route in the event that the USSR decided to invade. So if you look at the timing, this was very shortly after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Oh, don't worry, we're going to return to the communist era. Within the Carpathian Mountains also sits the Vidraru Dam. This was completed in 1966 in the Argeș River, which then led to the creation of Lake Vidraru. The purpose here was hydroelectricity, and it reaches up to 166 meters. Okay, I think we spent enough time in the Carpathian Mountains for now. Let's go to Brasov, a city that's pretty much within the Carpathian Mountains. First thing we'll take a look here is the Black Church, or the Biserica Neagra. It was built by the Saxon community in the medieval times, belonging to the Lutheran Church, giving off a Gothic look. It's one of the largest houses of worship in the region, and while for a while it was believed it got the name from all the soot in the 1689 Brasov fire, that's now seen as a misconception, and the name is owed to the industrial pollution. Hooray! Man-made catastrophe. Plus, that name really wasn't used until the 19th century. Most things in this world aren't so black and white, but since we just talked about the Black Church, we will talk about the White Tower now. This was built in the late 15th century, being part of the fortification walls, and it sits within the wood by the walls, sort of overlooking the entire city. Its unique semicircular tower is about 19 meters in diameter, and the basement has walls that are 4 meters thick. Speaking of things that overlook the city, there is also the Brasov sign on the top of Mount Tampa. It's obviously a Hollywood-style sign, and you can actually take a hike up to this, and it does light up at night. But I think Brasov is way cooler than Hollywood could ever be. It reminded me a lot of La Montserrat in Colombia, offering a great view. And while this may not have been as tiring as that, do prepare yourself for such a hike. Or you could just climb up all willy-nilly along the walls despite the sign saying not to do that, like a giant group of kids did when we were going down. It was kind of funny watching them get scolded in another language. Let's look at some more Romanian traditions. Weddings are a very big deal in Romania. Specifically, there's a tradition where the groomsmen will actually do all of the preparing for the groom, including shaving him. Yes, I'm talking about his face. Looking at Romanian composers, one of the most famous ones would have to be George Enescu. He also played the piano and the violin and was a teacher. Considered the best of the country, at the young age of 10, he actually performed in front of the Emperor Franz Joseph in 1891, and he broke American ground in 1923. A lot of his compositions were influenced by Romanian folk music, with Romanian Rhapsodies being one of the most famous, and he would die in May of 1955. Now, in terms of dress, Romanians these days have a pretty similar look to us here in the West, but there's certainly no shortage of grandmas walking around in old traditional clothing. Traditionally, women would wear full skirts with embroidered blouses, as well as the marama head covering, while men may have adorned shirts and pants made of wool and linen. Again, this is pretty old school, but you will still find the occasional young whippersnapper doing this. And I guess I should touch on sports. It's not really a surprise that football, soccer, Americans, is very popular, and their national team has won 7 FIFA World Cups. However, the national sport is actually something called oina, and this requires a lot of running and jumping and needing to think quickly. There are 2 11-person teams, those being at-bat offensive and the at-catch defensive, which switches during halftime. At-bat players essentially run plays trying to cross what is known as the escape line, while the at-catch players try to hit them with the ball. Hitting a player with the ball will allow you to score, and only 2 players can run each lane at a time. What I'm kind of getting is this is a fun combo of baseball meets dodgeball. If you're Romanian and you're watching this, do feel free to elaborate on this in the comments for me. And let's hit one more super duper interesting tradition. There's one known as the Dancing Bears. Basically, people dress up in bear costumes and dance. Okay, yeah, there's a little more to it than that. As the story goes, it mimics a far older tradition, likely dating back to the pre-Christian times, when it was said that nomadic gypsies were used to roam villages with bears, dancing with a specific rhythm. It takes place mostly in the regions near Moldova, typically between Christmas and New Year's Day. Did you catch me use the word gypsy there? Romani people, also known as Roma, also known as gypsies, are a semi-nomadic people group that actually originate in the Indian subcontinent. Now yes, I know this term has a little bit of controversy around it, and for that reason I'm not going to elaborate any further. However, it's not as cut and dry as you might think. I highly recommend watching this video here by Janusz from Living Ironically in Europe. He explains it far better than I ever could. I'll drop a link in the description. Now let's move to another city called Sibiu. This is probably my favorite European city I've been to so far, and it's got a lot of German and Hungarian history, specifically around the churches. The St. Mary Evangelical Cathedral was a massive sight worth seeing, completed in 1520, and looking out from the tower was such a neat experience. Architecturally, it's very German-oriented, but has Gothic tinges based on 12th century Romanesque looks, and in the 16th century it became a Lutheran parish, which I'll talk about more in a bit. It does 3 different services on Sundays, one in Hungarian, one in Romanian, and one in German. Another neat site here would be the Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral, being far newer and coming to fruition only in the early 20th century. You may note a similarity in its look to the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Bulgaria, and that's because the Eastern Orthodoxy at the time was very much inspired by the Byzantine style, with all the domes and whatnot. And fun fact, a private contractor was hired to decorate and create all the art in this, and it wasn't just simply mimicking traditional church insides. Now, another thing worth looking at here is the fortification walls, and they were actually built in different times throughout the Middle Ages. First layer here with the wooden walkway was the older part with the towers, But after a few hundred years, those areas built into earth were added to be able to withstand cannon fire. And could you imagine having to move cannons through the Carpathian Mountains? Now let's return to that Lutheran Catholic thing because it is a bit of a paradox. Basically, the St. Mary Cathedral became a Lutheran parish because this guy, Johannes Hunter, was a Protestant reformer who converted the Saxon Catholics to Protestantism. So, over time, different unique blends of the Christian faith took precedence, and according to one of the guides I was with, this has been seen as unusual and even blasphemous to people in larger cities such as Bucharest. I don't really have a way to elaborate on this. This is just what I was told by the tour guide for the walking tour in Sibiu. I like walking tours. They let you get a little lay of the land before you roam free. And speaking of cities, I guess we'll talk about Bucharest a little bit since it is the capital. One of the neatest areas would be Revolution Square. This one commemorates the 1989 revolution overthrowing communism, specifically this guy, Nicolae Ceaușescu. Yeah, I'm gonna put off getting to him for a little more yet. You'll find a sculpture of King Carol I, who is often regarded as one of the nation's greatest leaders. Yeah, actually, this is a good time to start discussing historical figures, and we'll start with him. King Carol ruled from 1866 until his death in 1914, and is seen in such a high regard due to the fact that he actually led troops on the battlefield in the Russo-Turkish War. The Treaty of Berlin in 1878 saw the nation receive internationally recognized independence from the Ottomans, and some say it gave early signs of democracy in the nation, but many also say the elections were sorta controlled from the top. What? Nuh-uh. No way that ever happens. But now we're gonna skip to King Carol II, who would become a Grand Prince. He didn't rule until 1930, and he was seen, a little differently. After the fall of France in World War II, he would align the nation with Nazi Germany, leading to the collapse and basically handing over power to the fascist leader, Ion Antonescu. Moreover, 1940 also saw the territory of Bessarabia, mostly in modern-day Moldova, be ceded to the USSR due to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So if you're ever wondering why Moldova became part of the USSR but Romania never officially did, that is why. And since I brought him up, I guess we'll keep going on with 20th century leaders. As I said, Antonescu was the fascist leader that oversaw Romania while being part of the Axis powers, and he actually facilitated the Holocaust in Romania. I say this in a lot of my videos, but I recommend researching this guy on your own because there's a lot to know. And a lot of stuff that I'm not going to say here for good reason. But what I will say is the mad lad tried to switch sides at the very end of World War II. Literally, there was like a month or two left in the war, and he was like, oh, wait a minute, I want to be on this side once he saw that the Soviets were about to mow down. It didn't mean much. He was executed. Bit of a pattern, huh? So that would take us to the communist era next, and we'll take a brief break from history so I don't ramble on too much and return to it. But for now, we'll talk about beer. Beer. Ursus is found all over the place here, which is a bitter lager that's Romania's largest beer producer. They also have the black variant for those that prefer the stout type drinks. Romania is also one of the biggest wine producers, despite being a lot smaller on the world stage in terms of these things. Let's return to some spooky stuff for a little. Allegedly, one of the most paranormal sites in the entire world can be found in Romania, that being the Sibiu forest. It begins with the legend of a shepherd who entered and never returned, and reports of light beams, UFOs, and other strange physical sights have been made over time. Some call this the Bermuda Triangle of Romania, and of course you can now tour this as well, because you know us whites love to flock to these types of things. Looking at some more physical geography again, Romania does actually have a coast with the Black Sea, which you might think is small, but actually isn't much smaller than Bulgaria's. There are several beaches, such as the Mamala, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus. Okay, I'm noticing a pattern here. Their beaches are named after planets. They're all very popular spots for the summer holidays, especially Vamaveci in the southernmost part, which has a bohemian holiday resort. Now, I mentioned Romanian being a Romance language, which means it has direct ties to the Latin language, and it was actually introduced by Roman colonists as far back as the 2nd century. Their variation of the Latin alphabet uses its own accents, such as some of these. For example, the little comma below the S means it makes the sh sound, such as Brasov. The second largest underground glacier in Europe can be found in Romania, that being the Skara Shore Cave. It descends as deep as 48 meters, and its ice walls are quite a sight. The ice block itself is said to be over 4,000 years old. Alright, let's go back to Bucharest a bit. The Palace of the Parliament is the largest parliament building in the world, covering 365,000 square meters. Its construction started back in 1984, so it's actually pretty new. However, a lot of military personnel did very backbreaking work to create this, and some even died. It wasn't finished until 1997, therefore it has a bit of a blend of neoclassical and socialist realism looks, and it hosts a few museums as well as 2 main branches of Romanian parliament. However, apparently 70% of this thing is vacant. Reminds me of these 2 buildings. Alright, let's look at communist Romania. It had 2 main leaders, the first one being Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej. this guy, which lasted from the end of World War II up until 1965. During this time, the nation was actually one of the most loyal to the Soviet Union. He oversaw a massive increase in heavy industry, which made Romania one of the biggest producers of steel at the time. Once Khrushchev took over in the USSR, there was more of an emphasis on lighter industry, and that would quickly see the loyalty to the Soviets dwindle as they started focusing trade more with the West, believe it or not. He would die of lung cancer in 1965, which takes us to... oh boy. Now, when it comes to controversial figures, I try to stay as objective as I can, but please bear with me because that's a little difficult to do with this next guy. Yeah, if you couldn't tell, I've been dreading this part of the video the whole time. So here we have Nicolae Ceaușescu, who would become the leader following Dej's death from 1965 all the way until the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. He gained popularity due to a strong stance against the USSR. As you recall, this is why he called for the rapid building of the Transylvania Highway. However, his popularity didn't last very long because as the late 70s and early 80s crept up, life under this dude's rule got incredibly difficult. And I don't just mean long lines and lack of consumer goods that most of the Eastern Bloc saw at the end of their reign. I'm talking about electricity being constantly absent, people's homes being freezing cold in the winters, austerity got really bad, repressions reached a pretty alarming level, and as things got worse, he got more incompetent, and by the end, he would end up the only former Eastern Bloc leader executed by the masses. See, I told you there's a pattern here. So now we'll talk about that. In December of 1989, he tried to address the people in what is now Revolution Square, which we've touched on, looking to harken back to decades of a time when he was a little more popular. However, he greatly misjudged the attitude of the crowd. Long story short, the crowd began to boo, and he was airlifted away to the town we talked about earlier, Tarhoviste. But that couldn't save the 71-year-old's neck because he was captured, tried, and executed on Christmas of 1989. Fun fact, the original reason we even stopped in Tarhoviste was to try to see the spot where he was executed, but it was pretty inaccessible. So we ended up seeing the Chindia Tower instead, which honestly, that was cooler. Now look, I understand you might find some people that see this guy in positive light. In fact, I did when I was there. A bartender in Sibiu actually gave me about a 20-minute earful about how much better everything was when he was around. But let's get real for a minute. I'm all about giving credit where it's due. It was really easy to do this with Fidel Castro in the Cuba video. Totally different type of thing. But I have a hard time saying the same about Ceaușescu. So I think I'm going to stop there. However, on the flip side of this, there was one thing that was very interesting that I learned while I was in Sibiu as well. Apparently, religion was tolerated considerably well compared to other nations at the time in the region. Most of the churches not only supported the regime, but the regime was also pretty tolerant on the churches too. And as the same guide put it, that probably didn't help with isolation from the USSR. Now, this should be no surprise, but architecturally, brutalist blocks are found everywhere, but especially in Bucharest. That's kind of common knowledge by now across the former Eastern Bloc, as these were built rapidly to house the peasantry and the homeless population. But I'm mentioning it because I actually got to spend the night in one. Stuff my small Western mind couldn't comprehend. But the cool part is that even today, Romania has one of the highest homeownership rates in the world. About 95% of their population owns their own homes. Compare that to, And before we move away from this general topic, I will mention that Romania actually had two different names under the Eastern Bloc era. It was first called the Romanian People's Republic from 1947 to 1965, and it was then rebranded as the Socialist Republic of Romania from 1965 until 1989. Just outside of Sibiu, you can find this neat thing called the Astra National Museum Complex. This is the largest open-air ethno-museum in all of Europe, and it's a collection of over 400 traditional homes, churches, mills, etc., reflecting the Middle-Aged peasantry and before. It's also very common for fairs and musical performances to be held here. Gun laws are some of the strictest in the world in Romania. To even purchase a gun, you first need to take a month-long, super tedious safety course, and you have to keep track of everything you own, literally down to the bullet. At home, the guns must be stored separate from the ammo, and you gotta pass all sorts of background checks and health checks, and the price to get a license is pretty high. In terms of ownership rate per 100 people, they come in number 164 out of the entire world, and there are only about 2.6 guns per 100 people. For comparison, the US's stats is about 120 guns per 100 people. Left a source for that in the comments. Just like for everything, Romania has its fair share of unique native plants. One of the neatest ones would be the spring snowflake, and on the topic of spring plants, there's also the spring crocuses, one of the earliest ones to bloom. The Burka mud volcanoes can be found in Romania. Basically, these occur when gases way below the surface erupt into layers of clay and water, and when the mud dries, the conical shape resembles that of an actual volcano. And apparently the mud that erupts is actually cold, not hot. In Bucej National Park, within the Carpathian Mountains, Romania has its own sphinx. Now, I don't mean a man-made one here, but It's a natural rock formation that looks starkly similar to the one in Egypt, and while it may be a bit of a stretch, certain angles will allow for a view that looks exactly like it. First known photograph of this was taken in 1900. But let's talk about a film that featured this. The Dacians was a historical narrative around the Dacian War when the Dacian people fought the Roman Empire in the 1st century. That's a whole historic area I kind of recommend looking up because I really didn't have time to get to it. Trust me, it gets very hard to pick which topics I want to talk about. Sibiu Niculescu was the director, and when it was released in 1967, it reached rapid success in Romania and is still one of the nation's most watched films to this day. While Romania was in the Axis powers during the Second World War, it was actually an Allied power in the First World War. You know, that war that always gets so overlooked because of the second version of it. Basically, it kind of became an Allied power by default because it declared war on Austria-Hungary. The main goal here was obviously to achieve national unity and the absorption of Transylvania, which they did briefly lose, but obviously they got back. Romania has the tallest church in the world, that being the Peri Monastery. It heavily retains features of the Maramuresh churches, and it was built in 1997 at 78 meters in height. And there we have it. I think I can say with confidence this is the coolest trip I've ever been on, and it actually probably topped Cuba, which I didn't think would happen so quickly. If you ever get an opportunity to check out Romania on a deep level, I highly, highly recommend it. I still don't even feel like I got enough time there. Its culture and its identity is very unique considering its surroundings, and honestly, the people have had some of the toughest hands dealt to them throughout history in the recent times. Yet, everybody was very friendly, very nice, very welcoming, and if you know English, you're going to be able to get around with a breeze. Thank you, as always, for sticking around for the entire video, and if you haven't already, do give me a like, subscribe, share, or comment. Ciao!